The early morning sun cut through the tall windows at Atlanta Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Sarah Bennett sat in silent quiet on the back row. Her navy blue blazer and cream blouse were jarring contrast to the casual attire most of the others wore while waiting their turn. The clock on the wall read 9:15 a.m., and the courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. At 42, Sarah seemed to exude a silent confidence from all those years in courts and boardrooms. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back into a professional bun, while her brown eyes took in every motion around her. Today, however, she wasn't here as an attorney. Today, she was just another citizen with a traffic ticket. The room smelled of old wood and cleaning supplies mixed with the coffee several police officers carried as they moved in and out the side door. Every few minutes would find the main door creaking open and some other nervous-looking person clutching their traffic citation shuffling in. The benches were hard, plain wood, not comfortable at all, but Sarah sat up straight, every now and then looking at her cell phone to make sure she hadn't missed some important message about her press conference later that day. When Judge William Harrison entered, everybody got to their feet. A bit over 6'5" at 65 years of age, thin gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses sitting low on his nose, he had been handling traffic court cases for over 20 years, and knew he was known around Atlanta as a no-nonsense judge who showed little sympathy to the people that came before him. He moved with the tired routine of a person who had done this thousands of times before. "Sit down," he gruffly said, not even looking up but still adjusting in his chair as he began shuffling through that morning's cases. Sarah watched as person after person came to the bench, most scared or nervous, stumbling over their words in attempts to explain their situations. The judge barely looked up at them, announcing fines and dismissing their excuses with the wave of his hand. His secretary, Mrs. Thompson, typed it all into her computer, quick sharp jabs of her fingers. A young man in work boots attempted to explain how he couldn't afford his ticket because he had 3 kids to feed. "Should have thought about that before speeding," Judge Harrison said flatly, no emotion in his voice at all as he set the maximum fine. Sarah was making mental notes of everything she saw. As a civil rights attorney, she had fought unfair treatment for years, now more than ever it seemed, in the justice system. But today she was here for a simple speeding ticket, one she knew was wrong. She had carefully prepared her evidence. Photographs of the school's calendar showing it was closed for teacher training, emails from the school principal confirming the date, and even weather reports from that day. The clerk had called Sarah Bennett, so she smoothly rose, straightening her blazer, and woke to the podium. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, echoing in the quiet room as a number of faces looked up, perhaps realizing how different she seemed from the others who had approached the bench that morning. Judge Harrison didn't even raise his eyes from the paper in front of him. "Mrs. Bennett, you're charged with speeding in a school zone. How do you play it, Your Honor?" Sarah began in a clear, steady voice. "I would like to present evidence that the school was closed that day for teacher training. I have documentation from the school principal, and the sign clearly states the speed limit." Judge Harrison cut her off, finally looking up with annoyance. His pale blue eyes barely registered her presence before looking back down at his paper. "The limit applies whether children are present or not. That'll be $250. Sarah stood her ground, her expression serene but resolute. "Your Honor, according to Municipal Code Section 40-6-1881, the reduced speed limit applies only during school hours and school-related activities." "I have proof that, Mrs. Bennett." The judge interrupted again, his voice keen with exasperation. "This is not a debating club. Pay the fine or appeal. Next case." The dismissal was clear enough, yet Sarah didn't budge immediately. For one brief moment, she stood there and took it all in. The dismissive attitude of the judge, the sympathetic look from the court clerk, the surprise of those who were still awaiting their turn. Little did Judge Harrison know that, less than 8 hours later, the roles would be a little different, and this small moment of injustice would have a place in a much greater story. With calculated care, Sarah gathered her documents, turned, and walked back down the aisle, head high. She had dealt with worse than an arrogant judge, and by tomorrow, the whole state would know her name, not as just another person in traffic court, but as the first black woman running for governor of Georgia. Sarah Bennett stepped out of the courthouse into the bright Atlanta sunshine, her fine receipt folded neatly in her hand. The frustration from this morning still lingered, but a hint of a smile began to play on her lips as she thought of the 5 p.m. press conference. That evening, she looked at the time. It was just past 10 a.m., giving her ample time to prepare for the biggest announcement of her life. She walked down the courthouse steps, noticing a small gathering of protesters entering near the front. They were holding signs about unfair treatment in the justice system. Sarah slowed down to read some of the messages, so that she remembered exactly why she had chosen to run governor in the first place. One young woman's sign caught her eye: "Justice shouldn't depend on your zip code." Inside his chambers, Judge William Harrison was taking his morning coffee break. He sat in his worn leather chair, reviewing the morning's cases with his clerk, Mrs. Thompson. He had handled 37 cases in just 2 hours, a new record for him. The judge felt proud of the efficiency, never once realizing that the speed did not always equate to justice. "That last woman, the Bennett case?" Mrs. Thompson said carefully. She did have quite thorough documentation about the school being closed. Judge Harrison waved his hand. "Rules are rules, Martha. We can't exemptions just because somebody comes in here wearing an expensive suit and speaking like a lawyer." He sipped more of his coffee, unaware of the frown that crossed Mrs. Thompson's face. Meanwhile, Sarah had also arrived at her office at the Bennett and Associates law firm, where her campaign team were waiting for her. Energy was high, with the staff rushing around to get press releases ready, finalizing speech details, and so on. Campaign posters were stacked around corners, still wrapped in plastic, for later release. "How was traffic court go?" asked Michael, her campaign manager, looking up from his laptop. Sarah placed her purse on her desk and shared the morning's events. "Well, I just got a first-hand reminder of why our justice system needs reform," she said, pulling out the traffic ticket and fine receipt. "Judge Harrison didn't even look at my evidence, didn't even give me a chance to properly speak." Her social media coordinator perked up. "Judge Harrison, the same one who made headlines last month for giving maximum fines to all those protesters." "The very same," Sarah replied. She sat down at her desk, opening her laptop and doing one final review of her announcement speech. The morning's experience gave her new material to work with. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Judge Harrison was gearing up for his afternoon session. He flipped through his calendar and noticed an invitation to tonight's political fundraiser out at the City Hall. Several judicial colleagues had mentioned that some big announcement was planned, but he hadn't paid much attention to the details. For him, politics wasn't really concerned. He preferred the simple black and white nature of traffic violations. As the afternoon, Sarah's office became increasingly busy. Her phone kept ringing with calls from supporters and media outlets who had caught wind of her upcoming announcement. Her staff had prepared her favorite navy blue suit for the evening, and her speech cards were printed on crisp paper. "The TV cruiser confirmed," Michael reported, sticking his head into her office. "CNN, Fox, local stations. They'll all be there. Are you ready to make history, Sarah?" She stood up and walked over to her office window, staring out at the Atlanta skyline. She thought about her morning in traffic court, about all of those people she'd seen getting dismissed and disrespected. She thought about her 20 years as a civil rights attorney, about her own parents who had marched for voting rights, and about her daughter who deserved to grow up in a better Georgia. "You know, Michael," she said, turning back to face him, "that traffic court session this morning was a gift. It reminded me exactly why we're doing this. Judge Harrison probably thinks he will never see me again." She smiled, picking up her speech cards. "I wonder what he'll think when he sees me on the evening news." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her office floor as Sarah gathered her team for final preparations. In just a few hours, Judge William Harrison would learn that the woman he had dismissed so easily in his courtroom was about to become the most talked about person in Georgia. The photo of Sarah that would appear on tomorrow's front pages was already selected. She looked confident, determined, and every bit the governor she purposed to be. City Hall ballroom shone with chandeliers and polished glasses as the most influential people in Atlanta made their appearances for the evening's political fundraiser. Judge William Harrison stood near the buffet table with a glass of water in his hand, making small talk with other judges. He felt comfortable here among people who respected his position and authority. "You might want to watch this, Bill," said Judge Mary Peterson as she pointed toward the large TV screens mounted on the walls. The screen showed a news alert: breaking news. Major political announcement expected in minutes. Harrison wasn't particularly interested. He checked his watch. 7:30 p.m. Had been working on 63 cases today and was more excited about going home to watch his favorite crime show than listening to any kind of political news. The room, fell silent as the widescreen TVs flickered to life to a live broadcast from the steps of the state capitol. The Golden Dome was aglow in the twilight, and a crowd had gathered, waving signs that couldn't quite be read on the television. A row of American and Georgia state flags fluttering behind her. "Ladies and gentlemen," a gray-suited tall man announced, "please welcome Sarah Bennett Harrison." He almost choked on his water. He squeezed his eyes shut hard, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him. But there she was, the same woman from his traffic court that morning, now strutting with confidence to the podium. She wore a different suit than earlier, yet her presence was unmistakable. "Good evening, fellow Georgians." The voice of Sarah rang clear through the TV speakers. The ballroom was now completely silent. "My name is Sarah Bennett, and today I am announcing my candidacy for governor of Georgia." The glass in Harrison's hand started to shake slightly. Other goose said the fundraiser began whispering and pointing at him, knowing he had presided over traffic court that morning. His collar suddenly felt too tight. The camera zoomed in on Sarah's face as she continued her speech. "Today, like many days in my life, I experienced firsthand why our state needs change. This morning, I sat in a traffic court where justice was rushed, voices were silenced, and dignity was denied, not just to me, but to everyday hardworking Georgians." Judge Peterson turned to Harrison with raised eyebrows. "Isn't that your court she's talking about?" Bill Harrison couldn't answer. You watched as Sarah held up a familiar piece of paper, a traffic fine receipt from that morning, the same one he had signed without a second thought. "This receipt represents more than just a traffic fine," Sarah continued. "It represents a system that needs reform, the system where some judges don't even look at evidence before making decisions. The color of your skin, the cost of your clothes, or your manner of speaking might dictate how one was treated." The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Harrison felt dizzy as he watched photos appear on the screen behind Sarah, her Harvard Law diploma, pictures of her arguing cases before the Supreme Court, images of her work with civil rights organizations. She had been a state senator for 6 years. She had won landmark cases. Last year even received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the State Bar Association. And he hadn't bothered to look up from his papers long enough to see any of that. "Your Honor," a reporter suddenly appeared beside him, microphone in hand. "Do you have any comment about M. Bennett's announcement about what happened in your courtroom this morning?" Harrison backed away, almost bumping into the buffet table. More reporters were approaching now, the cameras flashing. He could hear Sarah's voice continuing from the TV screens. "We need leaders who listen, leaders who look people in the eye, leaders who believe that every Georgian deserves respect and equal treatment, whether they are in a courtroom, a classroom, or a boardroom." The judge felt the room spin a little. His phone started to blow up with text messages from colleagues and family members who had seen the news. In 12 hours, had gone from respected judge to poster child for all that was wrong with the system. He strode to the exit, in his haste to get away from cameras and questions, until he heard Sarah's last words echo through the ballroom. "Together we can build a Georgia where justice isn't just a word on a courthouse wall, but a reality for every citizen every day, in every courtroom, outside." The evening air felt cool on his face. But Judge Harrison's world had already turned hot with embarrassment and realization. Tomorrow's newspapers would tell the story, and his name would be forever linked to the launch of Sarah Bennett's historic campaign for governor. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his dark living room. The clock on the wall read 11:30 p.m. The TV was still on, but he had muted it long ago. Every news channel was playing clips of the announcement Sarah Bennett made and mixed them with footage from the security cameras of his courthouse about how he treated her that morning. His phone had finally stopped ringing. 37 missed calls, more than 50 text messages, and his daughter had even sent him a message. "Dad, we need to talk about what happened today." Harrison stood up and went to his office in his house, turning on the little lamp on the desk. Yellow light fell on the many awards and certificates that lined his walls. Judge of the Year 2019, Excellence in Judicial Service, 20 years on the bench. These titles suddenly felt hollow. He opened his laptop and, for the first time in his career, began researching the people who had appeared in his court that day. What he found made him sink deeper into his chair. The young man in work boots that he had heavy find, a single parent working 3 jobs to take care of his kids since his wife's death from cancer. Harrison recalls dismissing his plea about not being able to afford the fine. The elderly woman who came to court late shed taken 3 buses to get here because her car was broken. He had tacked on an additional fine for her tardiness, without even asking her why she was late. And then, of course, there was Sarah Bennett. His hands slightly trembling, he read her bio online. Harvard Law School, graduated top of her class, worked on 5 major civil rights cases before the Supreme Court, started off free legal clinic for poor families. State senator, wrote bills about judicial reform, first black woman to serve as president of the State Bar Association. "Oh God," he muttered to himself, remembering how he hadn't even looked at her face. The security camera footage from his courtroom played again on the news. Harrison really watched himself for the first time. He saw how he barely looked up at anyone, how he cut people off mid-sentence, how his tone stayed cold and dismissive. All morning his wife, Cho, came into the office, carrying 2 cups of tea. She had been quiet all evening, which was unlike her. Setting 1 cup on his desk, she sat in the chair across from him. She said softly, using his first name like she always did in serious moments, "Do you remember why you became a judge?" Harrison stared into his tea. Of course, he remembered 30 years ago. He had stood before a judge as a young lawyer, watching how that judge listened carefully to every person, treating each case as if it was the most important one of the day. The judge had inspired him to leave his law practice and pursue a position on the bench. "When did I become this person?" he asked, more to himself than to his wife. "When did I stop seeing the people in front of me?" Susan reached across the desk and touched his hand. "It didn't happen all at once," she said. "It happened so slowly you didn't notice. Like a tree growing, you don't see it getting bigger day by day." Harrison opened his court schedule. For the next day, 28 cases, 28 people, 28 stories. He would have normally rushed through without a second thought. He picked up his phone and called his clerk, Mrs. Thompson, even though it was almost midnight. "Martha, I'm sorry to call so late," he said. When she answered, "Could you do something for me tomorrow? Could you pull the full background files for every case? And could you space the schedule out, give each person 15 minutes instead of 5? There was a pause on the other end. "Of course, Your Honor," Mrs. Thompson replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I've been waiting 15 years for you to ask that." After hanging up, Harrison walked to his bedroom window, the Atlanta skyline glittered in the distance somewhere out there. Sarah Bennett was probably still awake too, planning her campaign ready to change Georgia, and, without knowing it, she had already changed at least one person, a 65-year-old judge, who had forgotten what justice really meant. Tomorrow would be different, he promised himself. Tomorrow, he'd stare into their eyes. Tomorrow, he'd hear them. Tomorrow, he'd recall why he became a judge to begin with. 3 months had gone by since Sarah Bennett's dramatic announcement. The sweltering Georgia summer heat bore down on the crowd that had gathered outside of a small community center in Savannah. Sarah was standing on a low-budget stage, her voice solid despite having given 4 speeches already that day. When I walked into that courtroom that morning, she told the crowd, PR, wiping sweat from her forehead, wasn't a state senator, wasn't a Harvard graduate. She was just another face the system didn't want to see. The crowd nodded, a lot of them holding signs with their campaign slogan, "Justice for all Georgians." In the back of the crowd, local reporter Tom Chin watched people's reactions. He had been following Sarah's campaign for weeks now, amazed at how she connected with both rural and city voters. His notebook was filled with stories of people driving hours just to hear her speak. A young mother raised her hand during the question period. "Miss Bennett, my son got a ticket last month. The judge wouldn't even look at him. How will you change things like this?" Sarah smiled, remembering her own experience. "Change starts with awareness," she replied. Since that day in Judge Harrison's court, over 50 judges across Georgia have signed up for our new training program. And you know what? Judge Harrison himself was the first to sign up. The crowd buzzed with surprise. Nobody expected that twist in the story. Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Judge Harrison was doing something he had never done before. He sat in the jury box of his empty courtroom during lunch break, watching recordings of his own morning sessions. Next to him sat Dr. Maria Rodriguez, an expert in judicial bias training. "See how you leaned back when that woman in the hijab approached the bench," Dr. Rodriguez pointed out. "You leaned forward when the man in the these are unconscious signals that we send," spoken in a business suit. Harrison nodded, taking notes. His desk calendar now had fewer cases each day, allowing more time for each person. His clerk, Mrs. Thompson, had noticed it too. The people left his courtroom different now. Even those who got fines seemed more respected, more heard. Back in Savannah, Sarah's campaign event was ending. People lined up to shake her hand. Many shared their own courthouse story. An elderly man showed her a ticket from Judge Harrison's court from just last week. He listened to my whole story, his eyes bright with surprise, asked about my grandkids and everything. Then he reduced my fine because I'm on fixed income. Never had a judge treat me like that before. Sarah smiled, remembering the angry calls she'd gotten from other judges when Harrison had started his reform program. Sometimes, she told her campaign manager later that evening, the biggest changes start in the smallest courtrooms. That night, in hotels across Georgia, both Sarah and Judge Harrison were preparing for the following day. Her speech for tomorrow's rally in Augusta, adding notes about news stories she'd heard. Her phone kept buzzing with messages about polling numbers now leading in several counties. In his Atlanta hotel room, Judge Harrison reviewed the files for tomorrow's cases. Each file now contained not only the infraction but notes about the individual and circumstances. His new policy requiring his clerk to gather background information where possible, not to alter his decisions, but to help him understand lives behind the tickets. A breaking news alert flashed across both of their phones simultaneously. Georgia Judicial Council announces new bias training requirement for all state judges. Bennett case cited as catalyst for change, Sarah read in her hotel room, reflecting on that morning in traffic court. She hadn't planned any of this to take place in this manner. She had just wanted to fight an unfair ticket. But sometimes, the largest moments in life come from its smallest injustices. Alone in his own room, Judge Harrison read the same news alert. He thought about how one morning, one case, and one misstep had made for the biggest change in his 30-year career. He reached for his phone and did something he'd wanted to do for months. He typed to Sarah Bennett, "Thank you for helping me become a better judge. Georgia will be lucky to have you as governor." Sarah read the message as she prepared for bed, with a smile on her face, since sometimes the best changes didn't come from fighting against people, but from helping them find their better selves. The large main conference room in the Atlanta Judicial Complex was packed to overflow capacity. Center was full of reporters and cameras. It was 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, precisely 5 months to the day since the incident in traffic court that had changed everything. Judge William Harrison stood behind the podium, nervously adjusting his tie. Had never called a press conference in his life. His wife, Susan, was seated at the front row and gave him an encouraging smile. Beside her was Mrs. Thompson, his clerk, clutching a thick folder of court statistics from the last 5 months. The buzz of whispered conversations and clicking of cameras filled the room. "Good morning," Harrison started, voice slightly quivering. "5 months ago, I made a mistake that opened my eyes. Today, I want to discuss that error, more importantly what I have learned since then." The room fell silent. Reporters leaned forward, their pens ready. Everyone knew this was about the Sarah Bennett incident, but nobody expected what came next. "For 30 years, I have sat on this bench," Harrison continued, pulling out his reading glasses. "I have handled over 100,000 cases, and I have been wrong more times than I can count." He paused, staring directly into the cameras. "Not wrong about the law, but wrong about something more important, the way I treated the people in my courtroom." Across town, in Atlanta, Sarah Bennett sat in her campaign office, listening to the press conference live on TV. Her staff had crowded around, a few of them seated on desks, others leaning against the doorways. Nobody could believe this. In the Judicial Center, Harrison picked up a pile of papers in his hand. "These are letters from those who came into my court over the years. People I moved too quickly. People I didn't listen to. People whose stories I never heard, because I was too busy being efficient instead of being fair." He put on his glasses and read from one letter. "Dear Judge Harrison, I tried to tell you about my sick daughter that day, about how I was speeding because she needed her medicine, but you didn't give me time to explain." His voice cracked slightly. He took off his glasses, wiped them, and went on. "The day Sarah Bennett stood in my courtroom, I didn't know she was running for governor, but that shouldn't matter. Every individual who stands in front of a judge deserves the same respect, the same attention, be they a prospective governor or the clerk at the grocery store." Cameras clicked furiously as Harrison pulled out more papers, his own court records, from the past 5 months. "Since that day, we've made changes. Every person now gets 15 minutes, not 5. We ask about circumstances before setting fines. We started a payment plan program for those who can't pay it all at once. And most importantly," he looked directly into the main camera, "I've learned to look people in the eye when they speak to me." Back in her campaign office, Sarah watched as Judge Harrison shared statistics showing how his new approach had actually increased fine collection rates while reducing repeat offenders. People are more likely to pay their fines when they feel heard and respected. "But standing here today isn't just about sharing changes," Harrison said, his voice stronger. "It is about uttering 3 words that judges rarely say: I am sorry." The room fell completely silent. "I'm sorry to every person I rushed through my court. I am sorry to every person I didn't listen to. And yes, I am sorry to Sarah Bennett, not because she's running for governor, but because she deserved better. Everyone deserved better." He then made the unexpected announcement. "Today, I'm launching a free training program for judges across Georgia. We're calling it Justice Sees, because justice isn't just about following laws. It's about seeing the people those laws affect." In her office, Sarah rose from her chair and went to the window to look out at the Atlanta skyline. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't even about Judge Harrison. It was about something bigger, about how one small moment of injustice handled the right way, could lead to real change. As Harrison finished his speech, he did something no one expected. He stepped away from the podium, walked over to the judge's bench in the corner of the room, and sat down. "Now," he said, turning to the crowd, "I'd like to hear from them. And this time, I will listen." The reporters, much surprised, looked at each other, and then one raised her hand and started talking. Judge Harrison did what he should have done in the very first place. He listened. He had been doing all along. He listened. Autumn leaves were falling in Atlanta as Sarah Bennett climbed the courthouse steps, this time not as a lady with a traffic ticket, but as the frontrunner for governor of Georgia. 7 months had come and gone since that initial morning in traffic court. She was here today to witness something remarkable inside courtroom 4B, Judge William Harrison courtroom. It looked very different now. Gone was the hurried atmosphere. Gone were the long queues of irate people. Instead, comfortable chairs had replaced the old wooden benches. A digital screen showed each person's waiting time. Most surprisingly, there was a small play area in the corner for children whose parents had court appointments. Sarah sat quietly in the back row watching as Judge Harrison handled each case. A young woman approached the bench, looking nervous. "Good morning, M. Rodriguez," Harrison said warmly, actually smiling. "I see you're here about a parking ticket. But first, how is your nursing school going?" The young woman's eyes widened in surprise. You remembered, of course. You mentioned it last month when you set up your payment plan. Please tell me how your studies are going." Sarah watched as the judge spent 10 minutes talking with M. Rodriguez about her studies, her part-time job, and her struggles. In the end, he worked out a new payment schedule that fit her student budget. The young woman left the courtroom smiling, something Sarah had never seen. 7 months ago, during the lunch break, other judges from across Georgia had gathered in the courthouse's main conference room. They were here for Judge Harrison's Justice CS training program. Sarah slipped into the back of the room to watch. Harrison stood at the front, but not behind a podium. He sat on the edge of a desk, talking casually with his colleagues. On the screen behind him were statistics that told an amazing story. Complaint rates in his court down by 85%, payment completion rates up by 60%. Return offender rates down by 70%, public satisfaction ratings at an all-time high. The secret, Harrison told the room full of judges, isn't in changing the laws. It's in changing how we see the people in front of us. One older judge raised his hand. "But we'll never get through our daily cast load if we spend so much time with each person." Harrison smiled and pulled up more numbers. "Actually, we're handling the same number of cases. We just reorganized our time. No more rushed mornings. No more afternoon backlogs." And here's the interesting part. When people feel heard, their cases actually take less time overall. In the back of the room, Sarah typed away on her phone. Her campaign had already promised judicial reform to all of Georgia, but seeing these results gave her some new ideas. This wasn't just an issue of making the courts fairer. It was about making the courts work better for everyone. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the courthouse's new Family Resource Center, another of Harrison's ideas. Here, people could get help understanding their tickets, setting up payment plans, or finding legal aid. Mrs. Thompson, still Harrison's clerk now, spent her afternoons here, helping people navigate the system. "Judge Harrison comes in every Friday afternoon," Mrs. Thompson told us, "just to sit and talk with people. No robes, no bench, just conversations." Can you believe this is the same man from 7 months ago? As the day ended, Sarah stood outside the courthouse again. Television crews were setting up for the evening news. They wanted to cover the story of how a traffic court incident had sparked a revolution in Georgia's justice system. Judge Harrison came out carrying his briefcase. He noticed Sarah and walked over. "Never thought you'd be back here voluntarily," he said with a small laugh. "Never thought I'd say this." Sarah replied, "But I'm glad I got that ticket." They both looked up at the courthouse, its old stone walls glowing in the late afternoon sun. Above the door, carved in stone, where the words equal justice under law. For the first time in many years, both Sarah and Judge Harrison felt those words coming true. "You know, Harrison," he said softly, "some people think the biggest changes have to start with big action. But sometimes, Sarah finished his sentence, they start with a simple traffic ticket and a judge who learns to listen." Behind them, the courthouse doors opened as another group of judges arrived for the evening training session. It was one courtroom at a time, one judge at a time, one story at a time. It started because one morning, a judge who never looked up finally learned to see. A year had passed since that morning in traffic court, and the Georgia State Capitol building gleamed in the morning light, packed with crowds preparing to install the new governor. News crews across the country set up their cameras, all wanting a piece of this historic moment. Sarah Bennett stood quietly in a small office, looking out the window at the growing crowd. She wore a deep blue suit, and her mother's pearl necklace caught the light. As she took deep breaths, in her hand she held two items: her inauguration speech, and surprisingly that old traffic court fine receipt. That had started everything. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Michael, her campaign manager, now her chief of staff. "Ready, Governor Bennett?" he asked, still getting used to the new title. "There's someone here who wants to see you before the ceremony." Judge William Harrison came into the room, a very different sight from that first morning a year ago. Smiling warmly, he carried a small wrapped package. "I thought you might want this for your new office," he said, as he handed her the package. Sarah opened it carefully. Inside was a framed photo of that traffic court morning taken from the security camera. Next to it was a photo from yesterday showing Harrison's completely transformed courtroom, now a model for courts across the country. "From worst moment to best moment," Harrison said softly. "Who would have thought?" Sarah placed the frame carefully on a nearby table. "You know," she said, "when I walked into your courtroom that morning, I was so angry about that unfair ticket. I had no idea it would lead to all this." Through the window, they could see more people arriving. Signs in the crowd read "Raid Justice is listening" and "Change starts in our court," slogans that have grown from their story. However, the largest change wasn't in the signs or sloping. It was in the numbers. Over 200 Georgia judges had completed the Justice SES training program. Complaint rates in courts across the state had been cut by 50%. Public trust in the judicial system had reached a 30-year high. The program was now being replicated by 5 other states. "5 minutes until we need you outside," Michael reminded them. Sarah turned to Judge Harrison. "Would you like to walk out with me after all this? Victory belongs to both of us." Harrison shook his head. "This is your moment, but it'll be in the front row, doing what I learned to do best this past year, listening." As Sarah walked toward the door, Harrison called out one last time, "Governor Bennett, that traffic ticket. I still think you were speeding." They both laughed, remembering how far they come from that morning. Outside, the crowd cheered as Sarah Bennett appeared at the top of the Capitol steps. The old Georgia sun shone down on faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds. In the front row, Judge Harrison sat with his wife, Susan, Mrs. Thompson. Behind them were faces Sarah recognized from that first traffic court: the young nursing student, the single father, the elderly woman who had taken 3 buses, all here to witness history. As Sarah raised her right hand to take the oath of office, she saw Judge Harrison lean forward slightly, making eye contact, listening carefully just as he had learned to do. "I, Sarah Bennett, do solemnly swear," the words rang out across the Capitol grounds. But this wasn't about becoming governor. It was about how one small moment of injustice, handled with grace and determination, could change not just 2 people but an entire state. Afterwards, as everyone rejoiced and the cameras flashed, Sarah displayed the framed photo in her new office, the 2 images of that cold morning in traffic court and the transformed courtroom, reminding her, and all who visited, that most times, big changes start small. Later that evening, with the sun having set on her first day as governor, Sarah sat at her new desk. She picked up that old traffic ticket, received one last time. Tyne then did something unexpected. She framed it, too, hanging it right next to her law degree. Under it, she placed a small plaque with words, which would define her administrative justice begins with one person deciding to listen. A couple of miles across town, Judge Harrison was wrapping up his day, too. As he prepared to leave, he looked at the same words now carved above his bench. "I am not instructed by God for this case." He smiled, clicked off the lights, and walked out, ready to return tomorrow and hear more stories one case at a time. The story of the judge and the future governor had ended, but its impact was just beginning.